Let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful for our time that we have to study together. We're thankful for each person and the truths that you give us that apply to us in our lives, that bring us conviction. And we just ask, Lord, that as we open up your word together today, that your Holy Spirit can teach us and bring that conviction upon our hearts. Help us to walk in the light that you give us, that we may be a light to others. Help us in the understanding of Ezekiel and the times that we live in. We pray for those in this movement who are struggling. And we know, Lord, that you have a purpose and a plan, and help us to fit into that plan and purpose. We pray and thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Good morning, everyone. We are going to begin our study on Ezekiel chapter 24. And mostly we're just going to be dealing with 2 verses today, though we're going to be looking obviously at other verses. And I'll share the screen with you. And I'm going to show you some things first on the computer after we read these verses. Make this a bit bigger. It says, again, in the 9th year, in the 10th month, in the 10th day of the month, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, write thee the name of the day, even this same day. The king of Babylon set himself against Jerusalem this same day. So in dealing with this chronology of Ezekiel, we're going to go through overall the chronology, and we're going to be looking at it in more detail, of course, as time goes on. And we're going to spend some time today looking at this line, trying to fit in where this siege of Jerusalem lies within our line, how we understand what the siege symbolizes. And so this is quite involved. Obviously, we know that there's a siege in Jerusalem here in 587, and there's a siege in Jerusalem in 70 AD, and then we relate it to dates in our time as well. So first, I want to look at the siege and destruction of Jerusalem and try to understand the wording of this chronology and what this means. So one of the things we learned when we were looking at how we place a date within our calendar, because there are 2 different Jewish calendars, one that starts in the 1st month and one that starts in the 7th month. That is, one starts in the spring and goes spring to spring, and one starts in the fall and goes fall to fall. And yet the months are always numbered from the spring. That when you have a date that lies between the 7th month, the start of the 7th month, to the end of the 12th or 13th month, if there's a 13th month in that year, you then have this difficulty of trying to determine whether it's a spring to spring or a fall to fall calendar. But if the date lies on the months 1 to 6, you don't need to determine whether it's spring to spring or fall to fall. That's because those years will overlap. Now we can see here I have two different years. The one on the top is the years of the captivity, and those are determined to be fall to fall. And Zedekiah's reign underneath is spring to spring. So for instance, when we look at the destruction of the temple on August 18th, 586, on the 10th day of the 7th month, in the 11th year of Zedekiah, there isn't really a problem determining whether it's spring to spring or fall to fall, because the 11th year of Zedekiah, spring to spring, overlaps with the 11th year of Jehoiachin, Jehoiachin's captivity specifically, but it would have been the reign of Jehoiachin going Zedekiah's to spring, and Jehoiachin's fall to fall. So you have the captivity 11th year, fall to fall, and Zedekiah's 11th year, spring to spring. But since the temple is destroyed on the 10th day of the 5th month, and the 5th month overlaps, those 6 months overlap each other on each of the particular years, you don't have to determine whether that date is in the 11th year of Zedekiah or if it is in the 11th year of the captivity. If you just said it was in the 11th year, it wouldn't really matter. You don't need to determine it. Now, part of the problem that arises with the book of Ezekiel is that there have basically been two interpretations, that either Ezekiel is using a spring to spring calendar throughout his book for all of his dates, or he's using a fall to fall calendar in his book for all of the dates. And it became obvious that when I tried to do that, it created all kinds of contradictions that I could not resolve. So it was in 2016 that in a dream, I had the solution to this. And I mean, it was kind of right under my nose the whole time, but because the idea was so ingrained that it was one or the other, the idea that it would be both of them, that when he's referring to the year of the captivity, he's referring to a fall to fall calendar. And when he's referring to the year of Zedekiah, he's referring to a spring to spring calendar. So that solution is unique. I know of no one else who has ever used that solution to resolve the contradictions that end up in Ezekiel. Now, I'll try to show this and illustrate it a little bit more. The Seventh-day Adventist quarterly back in, I'm trying to remember when that was. It was, here it is. But it was back, let me think. It was quite a while ago. Anyway, now I'm trying to see if this makes sense. So yeah, that's spring to spring. That's fall to fall. 11th year. This is what they said is that the siege begins in 588. And the reason they do that is they use a spring to spring calendar only. That is, the Adventist Sabbath School Quarterly, when they did, it's on the book of Jeremiah, and they address the siege that's mentioned in Jeremiah and also in 2 Kings, the start of the siege, and then the destruction of Jerusalem. They used I'm trying to figure this out, if this is the right diagram. Maybe it's not. I'm trying to see if this makes sense. Yeah, so they used a spring to spring calendar, but I'm trying to figure out how this begins. Okay. What you see at the top is the 9th year, the 10th year, the 11th year. And you can see that this is a fall to fall calendar. And then on the bottom, you see a spring to spring calendar. 9th year, 10th year, 11th year, 12th year. And if you use Zedekiah's reign as the basis for the siege, that is, when it says it's in the 9th year, so let's look at some of these verses. We're gonna take our time. I don't want to go through this too quickly. And if we're not understanding what's being said, please ask the questions that you need to ask. Okay, that's what I need to do. Come through here. So the verses that refer to this is, it's in 2 Kings 25, verse 1. So let's go there. It came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, so this is talking about Zedekiah, in the 10th month, in the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and all his hosts, against Jerusalem and pitched against it, and they built forts against it round about. And the city was besieged unto the 11th year of King Zedekiah. And on the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine prevailed in the city, and there was no bread for the people of the land. And the city was broken up, and all the men of war fled by night by the way of the gate between two walls, which is by the king's garden. So this gives us both the date for the beginning of the siege and also the date for the walls being broken down, or the city being broken up. So when we look at this chart here, if you're dealing with the 9th year of Zedekiah and you're going spring to spring, from the beginning of the siege, it's going to be in the 10th day of the 10th month, and the 9th year would end at the end of the 12th month, and then you would have the 10th year, and the 10th year would be 12 months, and then you're going to have the 11th year, and it's going to end on the 9th day of the 4th month, or the 4th month's 9th day, 11th year, and this date is July 18th, 586. I didn't put our years there, but you can see the period of time is 18 months. Now, if you, and I put this is our calendar here. I think, no, this is the Jewish calendar here. Never mind. And then if I did a fall to fall calendar, and I believe that when it talks about the 10th day of the 10th month in the 9th year of Zedekiah, and Zedekiah's reign was fall to fall, well, then the 9th year would begin in the 7th month. And so this date would be, and this isn't quite right, so I didn't quite do this. How this is laid out is wrong. But anyway, it just shows you that if I start in the 9th year and it's the 10th month, then I would have the 10th year, and then the 11th year in the 4th month would be 2.5 years later. So you would have a siege that is 1, 2, and then a half of a year. And this is the position that is taken by the Sabbath School Quarterly on the commentary on the book of Jeremiah. Now, since that means that what they took the position then that both Jeremiah and Ezekiel are referring to dates that are in a fall to fall calendar. That is, Zedekiah, in their belief, had a reign that went fall to fall. Now, this isn't 100% agreement among Adventist commentators. One commentator we have, an Adventist commentator, is a guy named Hardy. I'm going to show you this. This is a paper that he did, Frank Hardy, PhD, in 2010 on the 390 and 40-day time periods of Ezekiel 4, 5, 6, and 9. And it's a very useful paper. He goes through some of the problems. One is he can't find a solution really to when the 390 years begins and the 40 year begins. He doesn't have a solution to that. But he does give us some chronological information. Now, he takes the position that the reign of Zedekiah is spring to spring. And in so doing, he says here, this is in his footnote. I'll try to get this lined up here. In footnote number 25, he says here, it could be that the chapters are not presented in chronological order, but there's no textual evidence to support such an alternative hypothesis. The date lines that occur in Ezekiel 1, 1 and 2, so chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, chapter 8, verse 1, chapter 20, verse 1, 24, verse 1 to 2, 26, verse 1, etc., all the way through, are all in proper sequence, and assuming a fall-to-fall calendar, range over a 19-year period from July 21st, 592 to October 22nd, 573. So you can see here that, and this is rather confusing because he's assuming a fall to fall calendar as well. So I think I got that backwards. I always do this. So let's go back, look at this. So this doesn't make sense because if you assumed a fall to fall calendar, oh, that's the problem. So now I remember what I did wrong. Okay, so here he's assuming a fall to fall calendar, and he assumes the same thing. He assumes that the siege is 2.5 years. And in so doing, you're going to have this, and you can see the complexity of it. I even get confused about it when I look at it, when I haven't looked at it for a while. But you can see if you have a fall to fall calendar, you would have a 2.5 year siege. But I argue that Zedekiah is actually a spring to spring calendar in his reign, which creates the 1.5 year siege. So when we look at the siege itself, and it talks about the 9th year of Zedekiah and the 11th year of Zedekiah, it's talking about a spring to spring calendar. It's not talking about a fall to fall calendar. But when it's talking about other events, it mentions them in the year of the captivity. Those events would have created, is if the whole calendar was in a spring to spring calendar, it would have created this problem. So my solution, I know I confused everybody because I confused myself. So let's take a look here. This is the chart I showed you first. We can see that this is the siege and destruction of Jerusalem, as I understand it to be. We have this Ezekiel wife dies, as we're going to see when we study Ezekiel chapter 24. But right now, Ezekiel chapter 24, verse 1 talks about the siege beginning on the 10th day of the 10th month in the 9th year of Zedekiah. And it's going to end on the 11th year of Zedekiah, as we saw in 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 1. And if we take the year of Zedekiah as being spring to spring, we have a 1.5 years for the siege. But I believe that we also have a fall calendar in the book of Ezekiel. And that is when we look at this fall calendar, if they had used the siege beginning in the 10th day of the 10th month, they would have had to call it the 10th year of the captivity if they were going to reference that based on a fall to fall calendar. But they don't call it the 10th year of the captivity. He says it's in the 10th day of the 10th year of the 9th, or the 10th day of the 10th month of the 9th year. And that 9th year is the 9th year of Zedekiah, not the 9th year of the captivity. Is that clear to people or not clear? Because I know other people are going to be watching this later, and I don't know if I've illustrated it well enough for everyone to understand. But if you're what's that?
I think chapter 25 of 2 Kings kind of makes it clear that that's the sort of gauge to go by for this.
So he's using, because in the book of Jeremiah and in the book of 2 Kings, they are taking the reign of Zedekiah as bringing spring to spring, correct? That's what you're saying.
Yes.
Right. So they're taking it as spring to spring. But Ezekiel introduces, for certain dates, he introduces a fall to fall calendar. And he only uses it 3 times, and it actually only affects 2 of the dates. But because of that, it created a confusion where people either accept that it's a spring to spring calendar, or they accept it's a fall to fall calendar. Now, what some people have done is they would say that Jeremiah uses a spring to spring calendar, and Ezekiel uses a fall to fall calendar, which really creates problems. It creates more contradictions if you do that. If you try to have Ezekiel always with a fall to fall calendar, and this is what Hardy does. he has this fall to fall calendar. So it doesn't create problems as far as the beginning and the end, because he says, assuming a fall to fall calendar range over a 19-year period from July 21st, 592 to October 22nd, 573, you have this work out. So I'm going to show you another chart. And I really want to work through this slowly. I don't want people just saying, well, okay, I just take what Theodore says and I don't really understand it at all. I want people to understand what the issue is. So here in this chart, I have set up, I'm going to have to make this a bit bigger. I'm going to do it this way. I've set up this chart here. This is, maybe it's a little too zoomed in. Okay. These are all of the dates given in the book of Ezekiel. It starts, as you can see, July 21st, 592 BC. This is Ezekiel 1, verse 1 to 2. It's the 5th day of the 4th month in the 5th year. Now, when we look at that verse, so here's the mistake that Hardy makes. He takes it as a fall-to-fall calendar all the way through. And when you do that, you'll do like the Adventist Sabbath School Quarterly does. You would end up with 2.5 years for the siege. But the reason why he does it, if you look here, when it talks about it, it says, now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river of Kibar, that the heavens were opened and I saw visions of God. And in the 5th day of the month, so it's the 5th day of the 4th month, in the 5th year of King Jehoiachin's captivity. So now adds it that it's in the 5th year of King Jehoiachin's captivity. Doesn't say it's in the 5th year of Zedekiah's reign. And my argument is that when he says in the years of the captivity, that he's referring to a fall-to-fall calendar. Now, if he had said it was in the 5th year of Zedekiah's reign, it wouldn't have affected this first date. That is, the first date here would still be July 21st, 592. Because it's in the 5th month, the month 1 to 6 are not affected as to whether it's a spring to spring or a fall to fall calendar. But he mentions it here that this is in the 5th year of Jehoiachin's captivity. Now, we have, obviously in chapter 24, verse 1, we know that this is also a date that's in, this date is in the fall. So it's from the 10th, from the 7th month to the 12th month, to the end of the 12th month. You need to know whether it's a spring to spring or fall to fall calendar. Now, we can show that Zedekiah's reign was spring to spring, and I'm not going to do that right now. And if it's spring to spring, you would have a siege that is 18 months. So they have this discrepancy. They have to either adopt that it's going to be fall to fall or spring to spring. And since they adopted that it's a fall to fall calendar, when they take the 9th year, the 10th month, the 10th day of the month, and you believe that this is a fall to fall calendar being used for Zedekiah's reign, then you end up having to move it a year earlier for the start of the siege than if you had a spring to spring calendar. So I'm using a fall to fall for the years of the captivity, but when most of the dates in Ezekiel are referencing the reign of Zedekiah as the basis for counting the year. Now, we're going to have a few other dates, and one of them is Ezekiel 33, verse 21. And you'll see this is another one that mentions in the year of the captivity. But unlike the first date that is in the 5th day of the 4th month, in the 4th month, this one is in the 10th month. And we're going to study this later, Ezekiel 33:21. But this is when the person who has seen the destruction of Jerusalem comes to Ezekiel and tells him that this city was smitten, right? It came to pass in the 12th year of our captivity, in the 10th month, in the 5th day of the month, that one that had escaped out of Jerusalem came unto me, saying, the city is smitten. So I'm going to go back to this chart here on the earlier one. And when you look at this chart here, you can see that there's going to be this escapee that arrives on January 8th, 585. And this is in the 12th year of the captivity. But notice it's still in the 11th year of Zedekiah, right? Because the year of Zedekiah goes spring to spring. Now, as far as that date, if you believe that Jerusalem was destroyed, or the temple was destroyed on August 18th, 586, you would still, in either case, have 6 months for the period here. The difference would be you would have, because if you believe fall to fall all the way through, you would have 2.5 years for the siege instead of this 1.5 years. And then you'd have 6 months until the escapee arrives, if you went fall to fall. But if you were going to go spring to spring, the 12th year that the escapee, if it's in the 12th year that the escapee comes on the 5th day of the 10th month, I don't even have it on here. I'd have to go and add more months over here. You would have seen that it would be a year later that the escapee would arrive. So if I was going to use a spring to spring calendar all the way through Zedekiah, I would have 1.5 years for the siege and 1.5 years for the escapee to come. Now, it's unreasonable to expect that it's going to take 1.5 years for the first person who has seen the destruction of Jerusalem in about a 4-month trip. If you were traveling with the caravan, it would take you about 4 months. But this takes about 6 months. But 1.5 years would be completely unreasonable for somebody who has seen the destruction of Jerusalem. This would be the first person that has come, who has escaped that destruction, who comes to Ezekiel. It wouldn't have been 1.5 years. Somebody would have been brought to him much sooner. So it's unreasonable to use the spring to spring calendar for everything. So my view is that when it says in the 12th year of the captivity, just this date here is the first one that's affected by it being a fall to fall calendar. It makes it that it's 1.5 years from the destruction of the temple to the escaping, or 0.5 year, pardon me, from the destruction of the temple to the escapee arriving, or destruction of the city. So this is the 5th, 1, 2, 3, 4, basically 5 months actually, from when the temple is destroyed to when the escapee arrives, which is the reasonable time that it would occur. But it's going to be a spring to a fall to, pardon me. It's going to be a spring to spring calendar when it comes to the length of the siege itself. So the spring to spring calendar affects the length of the siege as being 1.5 years, and the fall to fall calendar indicates 0.5 year for the escapee. So I couldn't use just a spring to spring or just a fall to fall. I came to recognize that the key was this expression, the year of the captivity. Now, we know that Zedekiah reigned 11 years, and that can affect some of our other dates, that they may be in the year of the captivity, even though they're not mentioned as such, because of how much later they are afterwards. But I'm not going to address that right now. So let's go back. So these are all the dates again in Ezekiel. Now there's 13 dates in Ezekiel. And if you look at these dates, I numbered them on the bottom, the order in which the dates occur in the book of Ezekiel. You can see that they don't actually occur in chronological order, as Hardy mentions. Most of them do. part of them here, if you look at these center dates here, these are all ones that we're going to be running into from chapter, later on once we get past to chapter 24. These are going to be dates, some of them about Egypt and so forth. And then we're going to have this one about Egypt that actually occurred last, but it's number 7 in the book itself, even though it's actually the latest date in the book of Ezekiel. And we will get to those later on. The main point is when we look at these dates, this date, October 22nd, 573 BC, and this date, the 10th day of the 5th, or the 5th day of the 10th month, which is, where's that date? This date here, in 3321. These two dates, this one here and this one here, are in the year of the captivity, as well as the first date. Now, the first date's not affected by that because it's in the 4th month. But these two are affected, 10th month, and this one's in the 7th month. And that's in Ezekiel 40, verse 1. And we've addressed this before, but this was part of the thing that helped me see that I was struggling with, because it didn't line up. In Ezekiel 40, verse 1, it says, in the 5 and 20th year of our captivity. So once again, he's referring to the year of our captivity, not to the year of Zedekiah. Now, that means that when he was talking about the year of the captivity at the beginning, and also in Ezekiel 33, that he was referring to a fall-to-fall calendar, because he says in the beginning of the year, that's at Rosh Hashanah, on the 10th day of the month, so that's in the 7th month, in the 14th year after the city was smitten. In the selfsame day, the hand of the Lord was upon me and brought me thither. So this one is in the year of the captivity, as was chapter 33, verse 17, or verse 21, pardon me. So this idea, this idea that this is now fall to fall can clearly be seen because it's at the beginning of the year, Rosh Hashanah. And if you were to count out this as being the 25th year of the captivity, the only way this works is if this is fall to fall. Now, this is why Hardy chose that all of the dates were on a fall to fall calendar, because this one worked with where he placed the destruction of Jerusalem. But the problem is it created other issues that he didn't address. So he resolved some issues in his mind, but he didn't look at all the contradictions that result from making the book of Ezekiel all fall to fall. And we're going to understand these dates. We're going to end up going through a lot of these dates. But for now, we've covered July 21st, 592 BC. That's when Ezekiel begins his visions. We dealt with the September 7th date, and that's the 5th day of the 6th month of the 6th year in 591. That's his second vision. And we also addressed his, this date here is August 1st, 590. This is his third vision. No, wait, yeah. Yeah, that's his third vision. That's the 10th day of the 5th month in the 7th year. That's the date that's going to be 4 years to the day before the destruction of Jerusalem. So this is 590. Jerusalem will be destroyed August 18th, 586. And then in his fourth vision, he's going to have the start of the siege. That's the one we just looked at, January 5th, 587, the 10th day of the 10th month in the 9th year. Now, what I probably should have done is marked which ones are spring to spring and fall to fall. But we'll deal with that later on, all these other dates. But is that clear to people? I don't know if I'm over-explaining things or under-explaining things. I do want to go to the board and maybe address it there. So. So let's take a look at how we have laid our dates out so far with the events. It's a little bit more visual. So I'm just going to go way back here to 627 BC. So what's 627 BC? What's that marking?
It's King Josiah's 13th year.
Yeah, so this is Josiah. It's his 13th year. And this is the year that ends the prophecy of Josiah after 350 years. It wasn't a time prophecy, but that's the prophecy of Josiah. So it's fulfilled there in the 13th year of Josiah. And then we're going to have 5 years. And this is 622. What happens in 622 BC?
He finds the book of the law and has a Passover.
Right. So this is the Passover of Josiah. And this is in the 18th year of Josiah that this occurs. Now, Josiah's reigns fall to fall, but that doesn't necessarily matter at the moment. And then we know that we're going to have, I'll try to make it, give us more room. What happens 25 years after the...
Jehoiachin is captive.
Yeah. So in 597 BC, this is the captivity of Jehoiachin. Which is also the captivity of Ezekiel. So this happens on March 16th, 597 BC, that we have this captivity of Jehoiachin after 3 months and 10 days of reign. And then we get to Ezekiel chapter 1:1, and that's going to be 592 BC on the 5th day of the 4th month. And this was the 3rd day of the 12th month, by the way, I think, or 2nd day of the 12th month. I can't remember. Too many numbers. So 592 BC, this is July 21st. This is Ezekiel 1 verse 1. I'll do it this way. 1 and 2, right? So that's Ezekiel 1 verse 1 and 2. That's where Ezekiel's visions obviously start. And he's going to predict the siege. And the siege is going to happen in 587 BC. And that's going to be on the 10th day of the 10th month. So this is the siege. And that's Ezekiel chapter 24, verse 1. So that's where we are. This is where the siege begins. Now, I say this is 5 years. Obviously, this is not really 5 years because this is in, it's like 4.5 years, right? Because this is in July and this one is on January 5th, right? So it's obviously, 4.5 years. It's not 5 complete years. And then we're going to have this period of time until, so I'll just put here 1.5 years. And this is the period of the siege. And it's going to end on the 9th day of the 4th month. This is in 586 BC, and it's July 18th. So that's going to be the walls of Jerusalem. Are broken down. And then you're going to have another month. There's going to be 30 days, or 31 days, I think. No, 30 days. Yeah. July 18th. It's going to be 31 days the month is going to have. And that's going to be the 10th day of the 5th month, and that's going to be August 18th, 586. And that's the temple is destroyed. And then we're going to have, that's days. And then you're going to have, from here, it's going to be 5 months. And then on the 10th day of the 10th month, the escapee, he's going to come, and this is in Ezekiel 33:21. So you get the escapee coming. So this is, we haven't really got to this yet, but we keep referencing it. And we're going to look, this is not actually addressed in the book of Ezekiel directly. That is, he doesn't give you these dates. These dates come from somewhere else, the book of 2 Kings and the book of Jeremiah. He actually gives you the date of the siege, but he never tells you when Jerusalem is destroyed. He just tells you that an escapee comes after seeing Jerusalem destroyed. So this historical information is not contained in the book of Ezekiel. He only gives us this date. But this date is also given other places, as are these dates. It would have been nice if he had given us these dates, but there's a reason why he doesn't. Prophetically, which we're going to look at as we get to some of these later chapters. So this idea of how we have laid this out is basically, some of the details here are quite unique in how I put them together because of the use of 2 different calendars, specifically this. Now, the dates that I'm using are the Babylonian calendar, and I'm making the assumption that Ezekiel is just using the calendar of where he is. The Babylonian calendar, for the most part, is identical to the biblical calendar, except that the Babylonian calendar observes each month, the moon each month, where the biblical calendar didn't in this period. It does in some periods, but in this period, it wouldn't have done so ever since the Exodus. So we're not really sure 100% that we can say that this is the Babylonian dates. If I use the Babylonian dates, some of these would be shuffled around a little bit, but like by a day. Nothing would be dramatically changed. I think it might change one of them by a month. But anyway, this is the Babylonian dates that I've chosen. And this is pretty much what most scholars would do. And it's what you would assume that Ezekiel is going to be using the calendar of where he is. He's not in Jerusalem. He can't observe the new moons in Jerusalem. So there's an assumption made there. But anyway, be that as it may, we have this. Now, one of the things that we know is that in Ezekiel 1:1, that he marks that this is also the 30th year. So this is 30 years. And because he's counting the years of Jehoiachin's reign, here in the 5th year, and then he's also counting based upon the sabbatical cycle here, both of these end up working out. That is, if you're using the sabbatical cycle, this would be 30 years. But if you just said it was the 30th year, that would actually be 29 years. So it's kind of interesting that he's adopted this language. And this is also the 5th year based on Jehoiachin years of his reign. So this would have been the 5th year of Jehoiachin's reign, fall to fall. So Jehoiachin would have had a reign fall to fall, and Zedekiah had a reign spring to spring. So this 30th year is this symbol that we get from Ezekiel that we can apply both to, well, we get it also from the story of Joseph. We also get it from the life of Christ. It's a symbol of a priest. And we also apply it into our history from 1989 to 2019. So that 30 years becomes this powerful symbol from Ezekiel. In Samuel Snow's letters, we don't have that symbol being used. So when we parallel Ezekiel and Snow, we can take some things from Ezekiel, some things from Snow. Some things are the same, but some are different, and bring them together in our line. Now, one of the things that we did back in 2016 with our limited understanding of the lines is we tried to put this on a line. Now, if I was putting this on a line, what would I mark as the time of the end? Which date would I mark as the time of the end? What do you need to have a time of the end?
End of the darkness.
Okay, well, it's not the end of the darkness, because it's in the period of darkness that you get a time of the end. But the darkness doesn't end. A reform line begins and an increase of light begins. So we could say an increase of light. Would that be better?
Yes.
Okay, what else do we need to mark a time of the end?
Fulfillment of a prophecy.
Right, fulfillment of a prophecy. So here we have a fulfillment of a prophecy, the prophecy of Josiah, and we have an increase of light. And this light has to do with the reforms that Josiah is bringing to this movement, right? So he's going to bring, so we're going to mark this as the time of the end. What would this Passover be? Would we put this in here at all? Would we, if we're putting it as line, what would we call this Passover?
Well, they found the book of the law, so there was an increase of knowledge.
Okay, so there's an increase of knowledge, but this increase of knowledge has begun with the reform of Josiah. So we could say that here the first angel arrives. Could we put that this is the first angel being formalized? Or am I stretching things by saying it's a formalization of the message?
You might
look at the law. Yep, Dwight?
you might be stretching things.
Okay, so you think I'm stretching things. You could just say that this is a part of the increase of light. Then?
Correct. Right.
Now, we have some other events here. What would the captivity of Jehoiachin be? Okay, so I'm asking some questions really without giving you some information that I'm thinking about. So this is a period of darkness. Remember that a reform line addresses the period of darkness. So what is the darkness that exists in this period prior to Josiah? And this is not an easy question to ask or to answer. It's an easy question to ask. What is the period of darkness that's being addressed here?
The progression of the idolatry at the beginning.
Okay, right. So there's a progression of idolatry. Okay, what else? Because there's something connected to that idolatry.
Well, Habakkuk talked about violence of the people were violent.
Okay, let's go back to the prophecy of Josiah that is fulfilled here. The prophecy of Josiah occurs under what circumstances?
Well, the setting up of two altars,
Okay.
which are compared to coming out of Egypt, the golden calves.
Okay, good. So
False gods.
So we have the Dan and Beth. We have the division of the kingdom of Judah and Israel. Why is the prophecy of Josiah given specifically?
To establish a waymark?
Okay, well, yeah, but it's given for a situation. So Jeroboam is offering on the altar in Bethel. And then this prophet comes in and makes this prophecy of Josiah. He also, the hand of Jeroboam shrivels up. He can't withdraw it. And we know that he makes a prophecy about what's going to happen to the altar. He says, altar, altar. The altar is going to be rent. The ashes get poured out. And then he also says that Josiah is going to burn dead man's bones upon this altar. right? So there's this prophecy of Josiah. And how does this all relate to the darkness that's here? And what would this prophecy of Josiah, how would this relate to this reform line then in the context of the period of darkness? I know this is a rather involved question, but why is the prophecy of Josiah given?
Well, what's taking place there with the false priests sacrificing on the altar, they're going to be, their bones are going to be burned at that there same place as well. So there's like for the wickedness that was taking place at that there time, Josiah was going to, in a sense, deal with that.
Okay.
And put an end to that.
Right. So we have this apostasy that has occurred. We've had this division. The two sticks have been divided. Ezekiel is going to really be addressing this issue, as you see as we go through Ezekiel, which really relates to our time as well. But the kingdom is divided. And the prophet, when he comes and he makes this prophecy about Josiah, it's addressing what's actually happening now. Josiah, his purpose was for a restoration. So whatever happened to ancient Israel in causing them to be divided, we know now that Josiah is going to come and do this reform that's supposed to undo what had happened. That's the purpose of the prophecy of Josiah. It is about the idolatry. So that's a major part of it. So obviously we see that in Ezekiel. But we also see that Ezekiel addresses Israel and Judah. And he joins them together in this prophecy of the 390 and the 40. Now, when we deal with the prophecy of the 390, this prophecy is going to end at the siege, right? So this chapter that we just read marks an end of 390 years. And this 390 years begins in 977 BC, right? Which is where the prophecy of Josiah began in 977 BC. So back here, you got this date. And that date is the 15th day of the 8th month, which is a symbol of the midnight cry. So, and I know it's probably hard to see over there. So this was an end of a prophecy. Now, this is specifically a time prophecy. But I said that this is the time of the end. Could we argue that this is the time of the end? That's a question I want to ask and you to think about. Is this the time of the end, or is this the time of the end? Because this is a time prophecy. This is a prophecy, but it's not a time prophecy. Why would I not make this the time of the end? There's some really good reasons why. But if you would say it's a time of the end, why would you argue for it being the time of the end? Because it's also the time of the end of another 40-year prophecy. So we have actually two prophecies marking the time of the end. Now, if you see two prophecies ending here, what does this remind you of? Two time prophecies ending.
Are you trying to say that would be more applicable to the second angel's message instead of the first angel's message?
Okay, so we could say that. I think of a place where two time prophecies end in Millerite history is October 22nd, 1844. Right?
Okay.
The 2520 and the 2300 days end there. But we do have another prophecy that ends in 1798, which we mark as the time of the end. Correct?
Yeah, the 1260.
So to me, this would align up with, and which time prophecy ends, because this is going to be Israel and this is going to be Judah ending here together. But in 1798, we actually have the end of Israel first and the end of Judah's 46 years later. But could we line this up, this time of the end up, with this prophecy of Josiah? Could we line this up with 1798 as the time of the end? Based on this prophecy itself, the prophecy of Josiah.
I'd have to give that a lot more thought.
Yeah, okay. So, and I'm not saying this is definitive. I'm just saying that if I was going to mark the time of the end, I would at least want a prophecy that marks it, because the time of the end is the end of a prophecy of some sort. It doesn't have to be a time prophecy. It just needs to be a prophecy. But definitely here, if I look at this and I see 2 time prophecies ending, that would remind me of October 22nd, 1844.
Okay, but all right, let's go back to your first premise about the 2 time prophecies.
Yep.
Okay, the first one that you've marked, where you're wanting to apply that to 1798.
Yeah.
Technically, you would have 3 that would end in 1798, because you'd have the 1290, you'd have a 1260, and you'd
Have a
also
2520.
have a 2520, correct?
Yeah. No, yeah. So we're not always going to have all the same things, but yeah, there is more than one time prophecy that ends in 1798.
Okay, now in 1844, you've got, as you just said, the 2520 and the 2300.
Yeah.
Now,
You also have the 1335 in the spring ending.
right, because that's a different situation altogether.
Right.
So basically, with what you're looking at in that 40-year period, at the beginning you have 3, at the end you have 2, so you have a total of 5 prophecies that are ending, that are all in one way or another tied to the time of the end.
Right. Yeah, and so another thing, okay, let's just jump ahead a little bit. What is July 21st, the 5th day of the 4th month? What is that a symbol of?
Well, in the past, we've addressed that as being part of the midnight cry.
Yeah, we would say it's midnight, right?
Okay.
So if we put this as midnight, we have time of the end, we have midnight. And we saw that in Ezekiel, he lies on his left side for 390 days and on his right side for 40 days. And he begins the 40 days on on August 15th, 591 BC, which is a symbol of the midnight cry. So you could even put in here 1 year into this midnight in the midnight cry within Ezekiel himself. Correct. Right? As symbols, they exist there. Midnight in the midnight cry exists in this period of time.
So what you're saying is that in putting this on this line,
Yeah.
25 days after midnight, he begins laying on his right side.
No.
Okay.
390 days after midnight, he begins lying on his right side. This is a year and 25 days later. Is that what you said?
That's what I said.
Oh, okay. A year and 25 days later. Yes, he begins lying on his right side.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So that gives you the symbol of August 15th.
Okay.
Which is, the midnight cry. So you have these 2 symbols here in this history, midnight and the midnight cry. Now, we have the captivity of Jehoiachin going back here. Now, in trying to understand Ezekiel, we know that Ezekiel is similar to snow, but there are differences. For instance, snow doesn't have this 30 years in there. And we know that things that Ezekiel is doing are symbolic of the message of snow or the chronology of snow. But snow's, all of his letters exist before midnight, where all of Ezekiel's dates that he gives us, where he actually dates them, occur after midnight. Though he does reference these earlier dates. These two by the 30 years, this one by the 5 years, and then this one based upon the prophecy of Josiah, right? So he does reference them. We get those dates from Ezekiel, but he doesn't have a vision on any of these dates. His visions are all on dates from midnight onward.
So are you trying to show then that snow is a chiastic completion to the situation with Ezekiel?
I think that's partly what it is, yes. So there's something about snow, the fact that he has these letters that exist before midnight and that Ezekiel's dates start at midnight. Yeah, there is something about it, whether you want to call it chiastic. But there's a typology that's going on here that I don't think I fully understand yet. And I'm trying to delve into it a little bit here. But when we have originally looked at this in 2016, we could at least recognize that this was a reform line. We could see that there was a time of the end, which we could place here. And we could see this was the midnight. But as we looked ahead here, we are trying to place, well, where do we put the midnight cry? Where do we put the Sunday law? And so in trying to lay this out, part of our problem was a lack of understanding of the lines themselves. So back in 2016, we had just found midnight. So we didn't have that symbol of midnight. And when we had gone over these reform lines previously, because when I came into this message in 2010, we already had these reform lines, but they didn't have midnight in the midnight cry. They had the time of the end, 9/11, and the Sunday law. And we would look at the story of Moses, and we would look at these different stories, and we would then lay them out on a line, in a reform line, and compare them to Millerite history. But in 2016, once we had these two other waymarks, midnight and the midnight cry, we never took the time to go back over all the other reform lines and correct them. That is, we never took the time to figure out where in this reform line of Joseph, or where in the reform line of Moses, or where in the reform line of Christ would we place these new waymarks that we had from Millerite history. There was some questions about it. I remember Jeff asking about it in the classes in the School of the Prophets in 2016, but we never did it. We never were able to complete that. And one of the things is in 2016, we also had introduced this idea of the binding off. And the binding off was something that we never really resolved. We knew it was this 4-year period, and it created a great deal of confusion to the lines as well, because now we had midnight and midnight cry and this binding off, and we were trying to apply it, and it was very, very confusing. And we had a whole School of the Prophets based on studying the binding off, and we never actually studied the binding off. We memorized some verses or some passages from the Spirit of Prophecy, but we never actually got to understand what the binding off was in the 3 months that I was at the School of the Prophets. Aaron says 4 or 25. I don't know what that's in answer to in the chat. What's the 4 or 25 in response to?
I just remember that number 25 was also part of the binding off, I think, wasn't it?
Well, it was suggested. I see, that's the thing, is I never understood the binding off. And it's one of the things I have to try to go back and figure out what it was about. We know the midnight to the midnight cry was 25 days. And that was one of the things that we had established. From July 21st to August 15th was 25 days. And there was something about the 25 days, but I don't really remember. But it was mostly about periods of 4 years, and part of it came from the prophecy of Josiah Lich. And there was other things connected with it. But I never understood it. So I didn't really, because it never really got completed. There was lots of different conflicting ideas about what the binding off was. I remember, if I remember correctly, Mark Bruce was one who was really focused on the binding off. That was kind of his baby, so to speak. So that's my recollection of it. And I always had a hard time following his presentations. So that could be part of why I had problems with the binding off. But be that as it may, we looked at this and we would try to say, well, what's going to be the Sunday law? Now, we have the walls of Jerusalem being broken down, and we have the temple being destroyed. And, we would need to place in a close of probation, and we also have this escapee, and this reminded us of Daniel 11, verse 41. So, so we were trying to lay this out, and we never got through it completely, but we tried to lay this out and understand how this could be. So, this was midnight. I think I made the siege, the midnight cry. I made Jerusalem the Sunday law. Something like that. I don't remember all the details of that. I don't even know if I really distinguished here. I don't think I did. I think I just put these together as one event, the destruction of Jerusalem, back in 2016. We hadn't really developed this so much. We knew that this was a time of the end. I think I took this as the formalization of the message myself. And the captivity of Jehoiachin was the empowerment of the message. And it being the empowerment of the message, this is the third 7 times. So now somebody could even argue that we could go back earlier. We could deal with Manasseh's captivity as a time of the end. So there's different ways in which this could be looked at, but I thought that I needed to address what was in Ezekiel itself that made the most sense. So when I'm looking at Ezekiel and I'm looking at the prophecies that he's giving us, these are the dates that Ezekiel's giving us. Now, as we've come to understand the lines, at least in my suggestions, that Snow, his letters line up with the prediction before midnight, that we can see that Snow has 2 parts to him. He has the part in which he develops a message, and then at July 21st and August 15th, he's going to give that message. And the first time he gives it, it's accepted, but it's not empowered. And then the second time he gives it, at least obviously gives it at Exeter, or not Exeter, but he gives it at Boston and the name of the place. What's that? Concord, and then Exeter. But the times that are actually noted in inspiration, there's nothing really said about anything that happened at Concord, really. And I would just look at it as a continuation of what happened at Boston. But at Exeter, it definitely is empowered. So be that as it may, we take Snow and we see he has 2 parts to them. Now, if we look at Ezekiel, one is we can see that there's events that happen in his own life. And those events would start with his captivity here, and then his giving of this prophecy here at midnight, and then his acting out the 390 and the 40 days. And then even when he gets to the siege, as we're going to see when we study chapter 24, his wife is going to die. He's also going to be made dumb. We're going to see what that refers to. Then he's going to be made dumb. And he's going to be made dumb until the escapee comes. So he's going to be dumb all through this period from the start of the siege all the way here for 2 years. And we're gonna study what that means and how we apply that. So we're not going to obviously complete this, but I want people to start thinking about it, that this is a reform line, And this reform line, in some ways, parallels Millerite history, as all reform lines do. But it has very special significance for us because we know that we're Ezekiel and we know that we're snow. And the relationship between Ezekiel and snow is very clear. So that's partly what we want to understand as we go through the book of Ezekiel. And especially as we start going through these later parts of Ezekiel, trying to understand how this fits into the big picture, that's going to be very significant. Now, one of the things about Ezekiel that we have to think about is that Ezekiel, the last section of Ezekiel, starts on the 10th day of the 7th month. And of course, that's a symbol. That date is October 22nd, 573 BC, 19 years after he begins at midnight. And that is extremely significant that not only does he have these two dates, the 5th day of the 4th month and the 10th day of the 7th month in his book, but that they are the identical dates that occurred in Millerite history, though in this case on the Julian calendar rather than the Gregorian, because we use the Julian calendar in dates in the past, BC dates. So there's something about Ezekiel that he has this history, but this history is obviously being typical of something else. And the fact that it points to the 10th day of the 7th month at the end of the book of Ezekiel means that this history here, it's either all of this history is typifying snow, or maybe some of it's typifying snow's letters and some typifying snow. So maybe we could argue that all these little events that happen in his life are being typified or typifying snow's letters themselves. Or we could maybe say that all of this is typifying snow's letters and some of it's just, or we could say this is snow's letters and this is Millerite history. So that I don't have the answer to. Maybe to frame it another way is that we have this idea of a fractal. And when we first had this idea introduced, we were doing it correctly. That is, what you do with a fractal is you zoom in, and when you zoom in, you see the same pattern that you see if you're on a bigger scale. If you zoom out, you still see the same pattern. You zoom in, you see the same pattern. But when we laid out the lines, the priests, Levites, and the Nethinims, we had actually departed from a fractal pattern. It wasn't a fractal. That was just an overlapping pattern. Now, it doesn't say that you can't have an overlapping pattern, that it had to be a fractal, but it came out of the idea of fractals, and I think partly because we didn't understand what the fractals were. But I still like the idea of wheels within wheels. So to me, wheels within wheels demonstrate a fractal pattern as well, but in a different way. And I'm not sure every one of us really understands what a fractal is. So that's part of the problem. But when we look at Ezekiel, we can see that he's tying us to different events in the past, and he's pointing to different events in the future. And he's connecting, as a reform line, the past with the future, and he's in the present. And that's one of the significant things about prophecy, that when you come across fulfilled prophecy, when you pass over the ground of fulfilled prophecy, it reflects back on the past, and that those events in the past shine light on the future. To understand Ezekiel prophecy properly, we really need to understand 977 BC, because that's referenced in Ezekiel. We need to understand this history of Josiah. So these are things we're going to have to go through in a bit more detail. We need to understand the relationship, and we've touched on them, but the relationship between the start of his prophecy and these other two dates of the Passover and the captivity. And then we need to recognize that as he goes through this experience of lying on his left and his right side, that it gives him information about the future. At least it gives us that information. We can now look at Ezekiel and see things that Ezekiel couldn't have seen. And one of the things we saw in Ezekiel is that he was actually predicting the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, even though he didn't know it. At least I can't see how he could have known it, because he's focused upon this destruction of Jerusalem, specifically the temple, ultimately, as we're going to see as we go later in this chapter. So it's a lot of information that we've gone through. Any questions about any of this? If I haven't put you to sleep. So.
Now you've presented quite a bit. It's just going to take some time to consider exactly what you're placing on these lines.
Yes. Yeah, and this is going to take us some time. I don't want to rush through this. I mean, we're going to continue to go through this chronology. And when I showed you this other one where I have all the dates of Ezekiel, the problem with that one is they're just a bunch of numbers. You haven't yet mentally attached events to all of these dates, right? So we need to have this story. The story helps us remember this, right? Obviously now we know the 13th year of Josiah, what happens is that prophecy of Josiah is fulfilled. We can understand the 18th year of Josiah, the year they find the book of the law and they have this Passover. The captivity of Jehoiachin, we've gone through that 3 years and 10 days that he reigns, and the transition from Jehoiachin to Zedekiah. We also see that Ezekiel considers that Jehoiachin is the true king, and he counts the years of the captivity as if Jehoiachin is king, though he still will reference some dates in a spring to spring calendar. And some of them, it wouldn't matter whether he is or isn't, but we do know that the fall to fall calendar is not the reign of Zedekiah. So whatever one would have to say is if we have a date that's falling between the 7th and the 10th month, and it can't be spring to spring if you're using Zedekiah's reign, it has to be fall to fall. And so it does create, there's still some dates which it's uncertain, especially after Zedekiah is taken captive. We're going to see when we go through later, we're going to have some dates that are in the 10th month or the 12th month, but it's after Zedekiah had already reigned and they're in the 12th year. And so the question is, well, are those spring to spring or fall to fall? And I have to say that they're actually referring to the year of the captivity, not the year of Zedekiah's reign, because he isn't reigning anymore. But those are not really important points. The main thing is that we can see that Ezekiel is referencing dates and he's predicting dates. And he's referencing these dates as a basis for predicting dates. And we see exactly the same thing with Samuel Snow. Samuel Snow is using the prophecy of Josiah Litch based upon the year-day principle that was established. He's not directly using Revelation 9, in some kind of way where he's saying, based on Revelation 9, we're going to know. But he's using some principles that were set up and established by Josiah Litch. And then what we see with Samuel Snow is he goes back and looks at these time prophecies, specifically the 2520 and the 2300 days, and also the 70 weeks. And he gives us some more information that he uses from these prophecies to establish the 10th day of the 7th month in 1844. But he doesn't fully understand the dates that he has passed through in writing his letters. So there's things that are hidden to Snow, just like there are things that are hidden to Ezekiel. Any thoughts on this? Any sort of problems or questions or thoughts? I know it's a lot to process.
In a lot of this, and I'm going to speak for myself alone.
Okay.
In a lot of this, it would be helpful to be able to consider the biblical verses that we're dealing with. I mean, in a lot of the past, with with some of the charts that you put together, you've been able to reference this. Now,
Yes.
that is something I've always found to be very helpful.
Yeah, and I'll email this again to people. I kind of corrected it. I had some mistakes in it. This chart here. So in this one here, I have all of the dates and all the Bible verses from Ezekiel. So you can look up these dates. Now, obviously, some of them we haven't studied yet, and they don't really mean too much at this point. But and Ezekiel does not contain the end of the siege, nor the destruction of the temple as dates. You can see that these two dates, the end of the siege and the temple destroyed, there's no number under that. That's because it's not referenced in Ezekiel as a date. But he does have this other date when we get to chapter 6, verse 1, August 9th, 586, the first day of the 5th month in the 11th year, that this date becomes extremely important in understanding Ezekiel. Because obviously the first day of the 5th month is important in Millerite history. And this whole story that deals with Tyre is something that's going to take us a while to sort through. So right now I'm just kind of giving an introduction to the ideas that we need to look at. And as an introduction, obviously it doesn't have enough information for us to draw all the conclusions we need to draw. Now, when it comes to what you're talking about, these Bible verses, they're pretty easy to find if you go to Ezekiel chapter 24 and you go to verse 2, and at least on mine with the cross references, it'll give us 2 Kings 25:1, Jeremiah 39:1, and Jeremiah 52:4. So those three verses all give us this date for the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem.
Right. I'm
Yeah.
just, all I'm referencing back, that chart that you had up, that you had in your, in the paper, the one that you had in the PowerPoint.
Yeah,
Okay, that one you're giving Bible verses so we can go back and we can verify some of this. Now,
yeah,
in the situation with Josiah and the others on the one that you just had up on the board, you're giving some other references as far as Bible, and Stephen was addressing part of that earlier.
yeah. So when we deal with these verses, I'll go back to the board here. So when I go to this board, we know that we have this prophecy of Josiah. This is given in 1 Kings chapter 13, verses 1 to 5. And then the fulfillment is in 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 15 to 18. Now, the Passover of Josiah is also in 2 Kings 23. And this is in the 18th year, as you will see. And when you read it, you think that this occurs in the 18th year until you go back to 2 Chronicles. And I should have that memorized, but I don't. But 2 Chronicles, I probably can just find it by going to 2 Kings 23. Yeah, 2 Chronicles. Yeah, it's hard to find. Yeah, it's 2 Chronicles chapter 34. 34 to 37. 34, 1 to 37. Or 1 to 7, pardon me. 34, 1 to 7. And in this one, this shows that this begins in the 12th year, first beginning Jerusalem, then moving to northern Israel. And in this chapter, it will then reference this same story in 2 Kings 23. So it shows that this event here occurs before this, 5 years before, 6 years before he has this Passover, that he begins this work of reform. So you have to go to 2 Chronicles to find that out. So that's a little bit involved. But this is something that a person should study and go through and try to understand, because it's really fundamental in understanding the fulfillment of the prophecy of Josiah and its relationship to the Passover. That there's this 5 years between these two events. So yeah, we did go through some of this, obviously, when we studied Ezekiel chapter 4. So those are things that we've studied. But it's going to take time for them to become fully entrenched in our thinking, that we can look at these verses and know the stories behind them. We can put them on the line. And I think it's important to try to understand this Passover, because the Passover becomes a significant event in Samuel Snow's letters. Because there's the two Passovers as well. So, the question is, does this Passover in the prophecy of Josiah relate in any way to those Passovers? Or is it just a symbol that we can tie together, or is there more to it? And then the captivity of Jehoiachin itself, what would that represent in Millerite history? So that's something else that has to be considered. It's not as straightforward as, just laying them out on a line and just saying, well, we have to put the waymarks in the same order, so let's just arbitrarily choose which ones are going to be which. I think that there needs to be a greater understanding of what this refers to. And obviously we have Josiah Litch in Millerite history. So, here we have the prophecy of Josiah and the Passover of Josiah. How do we relate those to August 11th, 1840? Because August 11th, 1840 in Millerite history is about Islam. But it's not just about Islam. There's obviously other symbolism that is there in that prophecy. So maybe in some ways we could again tie it to Josiah. Josiah Litch is tied to Josiah. But we know that Ezekiel is referencing Josiah. So that becomes a powerful symbol, understanding the connection between Ezekiel and Samuel Snow. And then we know in our history that we're referencing all of this. We're going back and looking at Ezekiel, we're looking at Snow, and we use Ezekiel and Snow and Litch, right? Because Ezekiel and Snow are using Josiah, so we're using Josiah in understanding how we apply the symbols in our time. So there's still lots to sort out. I don't think that I've sorted it out completely by any stretch of the imagination. So it's 9 o'clock. If you have some questions, of course, you can email me. And we're going to start going through, like tomorrow, we'll start going through chapter 24. But we're going to continue to come back and reference this chronology and these dates and try to understand why things are unfolding the way they are in Ezekiel. And we're going to see that there's so many different things that are tied together. It takes quite a while to sort them all out in your mind. But once you start to see these wheels within wheels, it becomes very clear that we're meant to study Ezekiel at this time. This is when the light of Ezekiel was meant to come to this message. Okay, so if there isn't any other questions or comments, we can close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful once again for the opportunity to study and for the things that you show us. We know, Lord, that there's still much that we need to sort out as we look at the chronology of Ezekiel. And we would just ask, Lord, as we go through this week, as we look at these different details, that you can help each of us to study these things out and to contribute to an understanding of these things. Lord, we need you and we need one another in order to understand these truths. So we just ask for your Holy Spirit to rest upon us throughout this week. And we ask, Lord, that you can be with this movement and those that are struggling. We know, Lord, that there's many people we care about and love who are hurting. And we ask, Lord, that you can forgive us for any hurt we may cause and that we can heal all wounds with love. So we ask that Christ's character can be revealed in us in spite of ourselves. And we pray and thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.